If you're watching this, hey, thank you, you're kind of in for a treat. The PBA and Nation's Passion is a documentary about the Philippine Basketball Association, which is pretty much the local version of the NBA. I believe it was created for some sort of anniversary, I can't really remember. But that's really all I have to say about it. I guess I'll just address the elephant in the room first. Why did I watch this? Why am I reviewing it? Well, my grandfather, my lolo, was in the NBA, was in the PBA before, and he was interviewed for this documentary, and I wanted to watch it just to see, if they paid tribute to him or anything. Unfortunately, they didn't really do that. And I think if you've noticed, I didn't do my usual, this movie's directed by, written by, starring, not just because it's a documentary, but because I stayed till the end of the credits of this movie, and there weren't any real credits. And that's when I realized that this will be kind of difficult for me to critique as a film because it's not really a documentary. It's pretty much an extended commercial. And I feel like it should not have been released in theaters because it's clearly aimed towards the PBA itself. I mean, its target audience is its subject, and I don't think it was meant to be seen by the general public, so it's kind of baffling that this got a theatrical release. So anyway, instead of a review, this entire video will probably be something like a video essay on documentaries and how I critique them. So here we go. The structure of this will be the following. I'll bring up a category. I'll talk about how that category can be used in a documentary. I'll talk about what this documentary in particular gets wrong, and I'll bring up some examples of documentaries that get it right. First category, visuals. A documentary still does need good visuals to clearly present what is being discussed, or to go to the extra mile to present the subject matter in a more accessible and creative way that portrays the subject matter in a new light. And it's very clear, painfully clear in this documentary that they filmed the interviews with different cameras, with different video settings, and consolidated everything without really bothering to edit further to make everything kind of look the same, and it does ruin cohesion. It makes things incredibly distracting. There is some archival material in this movie, like old footage of old basketball games, black and white photos and whatnot, and while some of this stuff is cool, there's just not enough of it to make it like really interesting. An example I can think of a documentary that uses archival footage really well is Last Days in Vietnam. And this documentary has just a ton of archival footage, but every single photo you see has such a story behind it, and there's so much detail in these individual photos, and they are just, objectively speaking, really good photos. Next category, we have sound. Of course, a documentary still does need good sound to clearly convey what is being said, or to go the extra mile to use sound and music to also portray the subject matter in a new light. This documentary also unfortunately has wildly inconsistent sound, sometimes almost incomprehensible sound, with a ton of background noise that no one attempted to clean up. And a documentary that comes to mind that has really good sound is The Square, which has impressively polished sound for a movie filmed mostly on the streets of Egypt during the Egyptian crisis. And I tell you, there's almost nothing more goosebump raising than hearing all these people in the square shouting at the same time, the people demand the downfall of the regime. It's such a cool moment in a documentary. Next category, editing. And this is probably the most important aspect of a documentary because editing allows information to be delivered in an intelligent way by structuring the film according to chronology, subtopics, any kind of arrangement. But most importantly, it arranges information so that it can tell a story. It's not just hard data. This documentary in particular takes a strictly chronological approach, which is not bad at all. A ton of documentaries do this. But unfortunately, it causes this movie to forfeit any kind of story that could have been told. Because when you tell the story of the PBA chronologically, it doesn't really have a narrative we can follow and like latch onto with human emotion. Because there are lots of ups and downs, yes, but there's no sense of accomplishment or satisfaction at the end. In fact, like the most accomplishment you can feel by the end of this movie is that the PBA is still alive today. A really good example of a documentary that uses editing really well is Hoop Dreams, and this was actually nominated for an Oscar for Best Editing, which like never happens. Because what Hoop Dreams does is that it takes this simple premise of following these two kids who want to become NBA players, and it uses their chronological story to observe issues about class, education, race. Next category, we have writing. And yes, documentaries still have writers behind them, mostly to gather, edit, and provide the information that the editors will later structure into scenes. Also, in other words, writers are responsible for the content of a documentary. And this documentary in particular uses a narrator all throughout the movie. And again, this is not bad at all. A lot of documentaries do that. It's just that the information being narrated is very strictly historical and statistical in nature. So it doesn't really mine the content for any deeper meaning, for any emotional content. A good counterexample for this, I think, is Citizen 4, which just won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. It barely has any narration in it and leaves most of the talking to Edward Snowden, but it knows when to step in and expound on certain complicated concepts. Next category, we have acting with quotation marks. No, of course, there's no acting in documentaries, but I prefer to view the people being interviewed, if any, as the actors. And I think you have to keep in mind that choosing to let certain people's points of view shine in a documentary is still kind of an important decision, because that could still heavily influence the tone of your documentary. You have to keep in mind that everyone who has something to say in a documentary represents a different side of the subject. And this documentary, to its credit, has a ton of interviewees. But what it gets wrong is that these interviewees are made to talk about the exact same thing that the narrator is talking about. So again, the information being given is very historical and statistical in nature. There's barely any room for personal stories. It's just very fact-based. If you look at the documentary Murder Ball, they have a ton of interviews as well, but they're all from like wildly different backgrounds, talking about their different experiences being in a wheelchair. There's some of them who really find their being in a wheelchair kind of like a blessing in disguise. There's some of them who are still getting used to the idea and still have regrets about it. If you look at the documentary 20 Feet from Stardom, you also have a lot of variety there. You have backup singers who are content being backup singers. You have backup singers who want to be the leads. And finally, we have directing. And of course, documentary directors don't have and shouldn't have direct control over what happens in the movie, but they're still responsible for the tone of the movie and the messages being sent. This documentary places the PBA on a pedestal, unfortunately, and never really expounds on the faults and dark times of the organization. And I don't personally know what these dark times are, but it's very clear that they are glorifying the organization in this documentary. Counterexample, you have the act of killing. This condemns genocide, but it does so in a way that takes on a tone that is at once terrifying and somewhat hallucinatory. It's really, really interesting. And another example is Virunga, which comes across as this real-time thriller, but it takes on this form in order to condemn the destruction of nature and to call us to action. So yeah, that's pretty much my quick guide to understanding documentaries from my point of view, at least. And the PBA A Nation's Passion is kind of a terrible documentary if I were to even consider it a documentary in the first place. I do feel kind of bad talking about this because I feel like I shouldn't have seen it in the first place, but this is my duty. I will talk about the movies that I've seen in cinemas, and I saw this in a cinema. Alright, so those are my thoughts on the PBA A Nation's Passion. Have you guys seen it? If you have, whether you agree with me or not, please leave me a comment. Let's have a conversation.